Good morning. I'm Christine Karadnitsky. Just a few sort of housekeeping notes before we start. This is the first panel. Our lunch break is at 12:30. We hope to end a little bit before that. The way the panels are arranged, each speaker will have not more than 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. I will introduce them each individually for their presentations, and we'll have questions after everyone is finished. 20 minutes is the firm ending, so I ask you to be mindful of that, and I can actually be helpful in reminding you. Okay. Kenyon Zimmer will start us off with The Lost World of Yiddish Anarchism, an introduction. Kenyon is an associate professor of history at the University of Texas, Arlington, and is the co-organizer of the Yiddish Anarchism Conference, as we've heard. He's the author of Immigrants Against the State, Yiddish and Italian Anarchism in America, and numerous articles on the history of anarchism. He's currently working on a book about the deportees of America's first Red Scare.
All right, thank you everyone for showing up for this fantastic event. Thank you to YIVO. Thank you to Spencer Sunshine for kindly making an offer I couldn't refuse to help co-organize this conference. So my role here is to sort of introduce in relatively broad strokes some of the history that many of the subsequent speakers will go into in more detail. So why is the conference referred to Yiddish anarchism as a forgotten tradition? Because although many people are vaguely aware that it existed maybe in the 1890s, there's not a whole lot more that's remembered other than a few figures like Emma Goldman. So I want to start right here in Manhattan with the Manhattan Bridge, because the chief engineer on the Manhattan Bridge was a Latvian Jewish immigrant named Leon Moiseev, who, if you Google his name, you'll find a couple of short biographical things. For instance, on the PBS website about the Golden Gate Bridge, because he was one of the consulting engineers on the Golden Gate Bridge. And it'll tell you things like he was a native of Latvia who immigrated to the United States in 1891. And then, as the PBS website puts it, he was so happy about living in America that he named his daughter Liberty. So, that's an inference by whoever wrote this that is not entirely correct, because Leon Moiseev became an anarchist shortly after moving to the Lower East Side of New York, where he first encountered anarchism. Like most Yiddish-speaking anarchists, he was not an anarchist when he arrived, although he had some radical sympathies beforehand. In fact, he named his first daughter Liberty because he was an anarchist. He edited the Yiddish-language anarchist journal Die Freie Gesellschaft, the Free Society. That was the liberty he was thinking of, was that of a libertarian socialist society, not what he found in the United States. But that's been erased, literally erased. His Wikipedia page similarly makes not one single mention of his politics, which he held throughout his life. And if you walk across the Manhattan Bridge, you'll find his name on a plaque or two on there, of course, with no mention of his political affiliations. Similarly, in 2016, Verso Books published a book called Revolutionary Yiddishland, A History of Jewish Radicalism, which contains not one single mention of a single Jewish anarchist. Which prompted the anarchist collective Crime Think to write a review in the form of a satirical letter to the publisher asking for a refund for the defective book that they had received. So what exactly is it that's been erased? What's been erased is a one-time thriving, vibrant, and quite influential segment of both the American left and the American Jewish community. This was a movement that you could find coverage on in Harper's Weekly, for example. That was once in the public spotlight, and even more so in the Yiddish public spotlight. This was a movement that lasted from the 1880s, when the very first Jewish anarchist group in the world was formed in the Lower East Side in 1887 in response to the ongoing Haymarket trial, that eventually resulted in the Haymarket anarchists being hanged, and persisted with some members of that first generation of Yiddish-speaking immigrant Jews into the 1970s and beyond, even into the 80s, as some of those, as Spencer mentioned. And they became mentors to subsequent generations. And Yiddish-speaking anarchists played crucial roles in Yiddish life, Yiddish language, and Yiddish culture in the United States and the world. People like David Edelstadt, the Yiddish sweatshop poet, Joseph Bovshever, who we're going to hear more about, the sort of founders of modern Yiddish poetry were dedicated anarchists, or Alexander Harkavi, the famous Yiddish lexicographer whose Yiddish-English-Hebrew dictionary is still in print and in use today, most people don't know, was himself an anarchist. He wrote for and contributed to Yiddish anarchist newspapers. So they played a role in literally helping build Yiddish language and culture in the United States and elsewhere. And there's more poets, playwrights, cultural critics, and translators. Yiddish-speaking Jews were prolific translators of great works of literature and science and philosophy from other languages. They were also prolific publishers and writers of newspapers. The very first Yiddish newspaper, Yiddish anarchist newspaper in the world, was published in New York City, Wahrheit, founded in 1889, a paper on which David Edelstadt, among others, worked. This first generation of Yiddish-speaking Jewish anarchists on the Lower East Side and places like Philadelphia was profoundly influenced, as we're going to hear from Tom Goyens, by their German anarchist neighbors, as the two languages are linked and somewhat mutually intelligible. But by far the most important Yiddish anarchist newspaper in both the United States and the world was the Freie Arbeiterstimme, the Free Voice of Labor, which persisted with brief interruptions from 1889 to 1977. The Freie Arbeiterstimme was both the largest circulating and longest lasting anarchist newspaper in American history. And yet, only about half a dozen scholars have ever read it. Its readership extended across the globe, but was particularly concentrated, of course, in the United States and places like New York. These are the circulation figures for the Freie Arbeiterstimme, which peaked at about 30,000 copies per issue in 1914, which various estimates place at a readership of 100, 150,000 or so. Just to put this into perspective, as late as 1904, 1905, 1906, the Yiddish Daily Forward only had a circulation about 3 times that of the Freie Arbeiterstimme. The longtime editor of the Freie Arbeiterstimme was the anarchist Saul Janowski, who was profoundly important not only as a commentator on anarchist ideas, on the Jewish labor movement, but also on Yiddish literature and poetry. He was renowned for discovering new Yiddish poetic talent and first publishing it in the anarchist Freie Arbeiterstimme. As one of his late contemporaries put it, for a few continuous decades, he was the spiritual trailblazer for innumerable Jewish journalists, writers, actors, trade union organizers, and community leaders in Jewish society, and hence in the social life of millions of immigrant Jews in their new home. Yet, while I imagine everyone in this room has heard of Gahan, of the Jewish Daily Forward, the name of Janowski will be new to probably at least some of you. Over time, the Yiddish anarchists developed a particular shared understanding of Jewish identity and Jewishness, or Yiddishkeit. This was defined by Yiddish language, was one of the defining characteristics, which of course, that's a whole, excludes Sephardic and other Jewish groups, absolutely, was based in secular Yiddish culture and in a common enemy in anti-Semitism. In fact, one early Yiddish anarchist statement on Jewishness stated that it was anti-Semitism in particular that bound Jews together as a group. What it was not defined by, importantly, was any sort of territorial homeland. This was a very explicitly non-Zionist, non-territorialist definition of Jewishness. It was largely a definition that rejected Judaism as an essential core of Jewish identity, but there's an asterisk there because there were some important exceptions, some of which we'll hear about later in later panels with individuals like Abba Gordon, who very much tried to link Jewish religious tradition to anarchism. And it also did not define Jewishness by biology or descent. This was a flexible, cultural, and linguistic definition of what it meant to be a Jew, or at least a Yiddish anarchist. It was flexible enough to include people who had no Jewish ancestry. People like Rudolf Rocker, who was a German Gentile, who we'll hear more about from Ben Gidley on a later panel, who, after moving to London and encountering Yiddish-speaking anarchists there, taught himself Yiddish and went on to become editor of the Arbeiterfreund, an important Yiddish anarchist newspaper there. Eventually, he was deported to Germany during World War I, and then fled Nazism to the United States in 1933, and remained a towering figure in Yiddish anarchist circles, referred to by many as an anarchist rabbi, but a very peculiar rabbi with no actual Jewish ancestry. Also, the native-born American anarchist Voltairine de Cleyre, who was a major figure in Philadelphia's anarchist movement and was very close to the Yiddish-speaking anarchist movement there. She taught Jewish anarchists like Joseph J. Cohen, who was a successor of Janowski at the Freie Arbeiter Stimme, taught them English, and they taught her Yiddish. She learned to write Yiddish. We have handwritten Yiddish letters and articles of her here held in YIVO, in a collection that's a shared collection with her and Joseph J. Cohen, whose great-granddaughter is with us today. And she wrote original Yiddish language articles for the Freie Arbeiter Stimme. So you could be a Yiddish anarchist without being actually a Jewish anarchist, in other words. Voltairine de Cleyre also belonged to the Philadelphia anarchist branch of the Workmen's Circle, the Jewish socialist fraternal organization, which actually had more than a dozen explicitly anarchist branches, some of which, like the Radical Library Group in Philadelphia, included non-Jewish members, which was unusual. Of course, the most famous Jewish anarchist in American history is Emma Goldman. If you've ever heard of one single Jewish anarchist, it's Emma Goldman, who had a long, storied, well-covered career that led to her being arrested at least 16 times on various charges that I don't have time to enumerate, but they're there on the screen. And which eventually resulted in her deportation in 1919. Although even that did not cease her activity, she of course went on to become a very early and influential left-wing critic of Soviet communism. Now, one of the peculiar things about Emma Goldman, who's often pointed to as a sort of quintessential Jewish anarchist, is although she was multilingual, she spoke Yiddish, German, Russian, and English, she didn't feel comfortable speaking in Yiddish. So although she delivered lectures in Yiddish, she preferred other languages, and increasingly over time preferred to focus on English language propaganda to try to reach English-speaking American workers. So she was actually really sort of on the margins of the Yiddish anarchist movement, so to speak. There are many other Yiddish-speaking anarchist women who have been largely forgotten by history. Women like Katerina Yevzorov, who was a remarkable, educated Russian Jewish woman. She earned her medical degree at NYU in 1893. She was an official in the Workmen's Circle. She wrote on women's issues, on so for example, she wrote a book, Die Frau und der Gesellschaft, The Woman and Society, which used anthropological evidence to argue, essentially to argue in favor of a critique of patriarchy. She, I've learned from Dr. Elena Torres, is rumored to be the inspiration for the original short story Yentl by Singer. She also was, intriguingly, although an anarchist, a proponent of women's suffrage, and involved in the suffragist movement. And she also helped her husband, the prolific anarchist writer and translator Jacob Marison, produce the first and only Yiddish translation of Marx's Das Kapital. But you'll find many women, many of whose names have been forgotten and lost to history, in the rank and file of the Jewish anarchist movement. The Jewish anarchist movement in the United States had by far the greatest gender representation of women of any ethnic or linguistic segment of the movement. And that has to do partially with the demographics of Jewish immigration, but also to a real commitment on many participants' part to women's equality. So here, for instance, we have a group of Jewish anarchists in Chicago, and in the front, we have two organizers, Aaron Barron and his wife Fania Barron, who were organizers for both the Industrial Workers of the World and also an organization called the Union of Russian Workers, which we're going to learn more about later today. They were involved in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. You would find them on the front lines of the Great Uprising of 1909. In the 1910, the uprising of the 20,000 in 1909, the Great Uprising in 1910. In fact, the head of the picket committee for the 1910 garment workers' strike was the anarchist Morris Sigmund, who ended up having to fight a false murder charge along with some other organizers as a result of that. In the Triangular Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, one of the survivors of that fire, who was just exiting the building when the fire broke out and who witnessed more than 140 of her co-workers plummet or burn to death, was the anarchist Mary Abrams, who was part of a four-person bargaining committee, informal bargaining committee within the Triangular Shirtwaist Factory fire. She eventually was deported from the United States with her husband, Jacob Abrams, during the first Red Scare. They ended up living in Mexico City in exile after leaving the Soviet Union, where, according to one story, Jack Abrams used to play chess with Trotsky, and they would argue about Stalin and Kronstadt. Morris Zygmunt went on to become president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union from 1923 to 1928. So for most of the 1920s, the president of one of the most important unions in the country was a Yiddish-speaking Jewish anarchist. Although in a lot of historical works, you'll find him referred to as a right-wing socialist somehow. He's also the only anarchist to have a Liberty ship named after him during World War II. A very peculiar honor. Rose Posada is one of the most famous anarchist members of the LGW. She was an organizer, eventual vice president of that union. And I want to talk a little bit about the persistence of Jewish anarchism, even in the face of the enormity of the Second World War and the Holocaust. So after the Second World War, the ILGWU sent Rose Posada and some others as part of a group to go to post-war Europe to visit devastated Jewish communities and figure out the best way that the union and its membership could aid those communities. So Posada, among other places, visited what remained of the Jewish ghetto in Łódź, Poland, or Lodz. And she wrote in an unpublished account that as they were visiting places, she encountered a man who had under his arm a copy of the Freie Arbeiterstimme. Turned out he was a friend of a friend. He asked how the union could help them. He was involved in a Jewish underwear-making cooperative that they had started up. He introduced her to the other surviving members of his anarchist group. And this is what she wrote. Curiously enough, none of them asked for help for themselves or for visas, but all they wanted was moral support, literature, a printing press, and a linotype machine in Polish. Not Yiddish, Polish. Also, new material, as well as old books and pamphlets by Kropotkin, Rudolf Rocker, Carlo Bernieri, and others to be reprinted in Polish. So in other words, in the aftermath of the Holocaust in Poland, the survivors of the Jewish ghetto there wanted nothing more than to reach out to their Polish-speaking neighbors with the message of libertarian socialism and mutual aid. And I can't think of a more profound illustration of the commitment to these ideals than that. So in short, this is a remarkable history that's been largely forgotten, made up of people who, as is summed up in the epitaph on Saul Janowski's grave over in Mount Carmel Cemetery, were ardently and unselfishly devoted toward establishing human society on principles of no coercion and no exploitation. And I think for that alone, they deserve our recognition and remembrance, to say nothing of their actual major contributions to Jewish culture and the Jewish labor movement that I've very briefly run through here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenyon. Tom Goyens will speak next on Radical Neighbors, New York's German and Yiddish Anarchists, 1880-1906. Tom is an associate professor of history at Salisbury University in Maryland. His research focuses on immigrant anarchism in the United States. He's the author of, this is good, Beer and Revolution, the German anarchist movement in New York City, 1880-1914, editor of Helene Menken's memoir, Storm in My Heart, Memories from the Widow of Johann Most, and editor of Radical Gotham, Anarchism in New York City, From Schwab's Saloon to Occupy Wall Street. His articles have appeared in Social Anarchism, Rethinking History, the Journal of Theory and Practice, and the Journal for the Study of Radicalism. He's currently writing a new biography of Johann Most.
All right, thank you for coming. I'm honored to be here. So my paper is, I'm going to just give some aspects of this symbiotic relationship between the German and Yiddish anarchists. There's a lot to say here, and I can certainly elaborate a little more later. I basically argue that, broadly speaking, the single most important legacy of the German anarchist movement in New York was to lay the groundwork for the Yiddish one. And the Yiddish anarchist movement then sort of transmits anarchism into the 20th century, I think. And that's sort of really broad lines here. We have heard a little bit, oh, this doesn't. Okay, that's supposed to be Manhattan and the Lower East Side. But you can, I don't know if you could sort of make out, here's the East River there, but we've heard a little bit, so Yiddish anarchism emerges in New York City in like the 1880s. It's in the Little Germany section of Lower Manhattan, Klein Deutschland. And Yiddish was adopted by that movement as, I think they go through sort of Russian intellectuals and then almost via German adopt sort of the Yiddish language of the rank and file. And it's, so with this slide, it doesn't come out very well, but I don't know if you could see the black dots and the red dots. So the black dots are the German, this is selective, the German meeting places that this is a map I've used in my first book, and I've sort of mapped on some of the Yiddish meeting places that are sort of in the Lower East Side. And so I think Kenyon Zimmer in his book has called it sort of a geographic and linguistic proximity of the two movements. Okay, So I think the affinity between the German and Yiddish anarchists is best embodied in the person of Johann Most. I don't have time to do a broad biography here, but he was a German atheist, firebrand anarchist speaker who arrives in New York City in December 1882. He had just finished a 16-month prison sentence because he had publicly celebrated the assassination of the Tsar. And so this caused, including in Russia, caused many Russian Jews and revolutionaries to immigrate to the United States. So Most comes a bit later in late 1882. So one thing that's particularly important here is Most's fiery oratory. We have lots of commentary on this that seem to have really sort of mesmerized not just Yiddish-speaking anarchists, but many. And so I have a few sort of eyewitnesses. There are a number of them. Kopelov, for example, called Most the giant of the revolution. And he remembered, quote, the audience was as if in a hypnotic spell. Chaim Weinberg of Philadelphia recalled that Most, quote, all but bewitched every listener, opponent, as well as friend. And Julius Seltzer stated that, quote, Most, more than anyone else, made an anarchist out of me. It's maybe, it's very important to stress how important oratory was in these movements. Most also employed a young Jewish activist named Alexander Berkman, who some of you know, in his Freiheit office. So Most had been publishing this German language anarchist, socialist first, but then anarchist newspaper. Okay, sticking with Johann Most for a minute, there were many, well, not many, but there were a few sort of intimate connections between Most and Jewish activists. One, Kenyon mentioned Emma Goldman, and there's more to this than that I perhaps have time for now, but they later on have a falling out over a number of issues, including gender, political violence as a tactic. I do want to mention one thing that's sort of relevant here, I think, that when this sort of blows up, at a meeting of the Pioneers of Liberty, this was one of the first Yiddish anarchist groups in New York. At one of those meetings, Goldman horsewhipped Most in public on the stage. We have a few accounts of this. This made a sensation, and I've always sort of wondered what was sort of the fallout internally in the movement about it. So in the wake of this was in 1892, the Pioneers of Liberty basically condemned Goldman, as they called it, wickedness, this behavior. In return, Goldman publishes a small, what is that called? Rebuttal, I guess, in another German anarchist newspaper, not Freiheit. There was a rival of Freiheit, and in which she claimed that Most, he always had the quote is the greatest contempt for Jewish anarchists, and so that's sort of intriguing. I think it's a little bit over the top because there were so many close relationships between Most and Jewish anarchists. After that, he does regular lecture series on topics of history in many of these Yiddish anarchist groups. So the other person here in the middle is Helena Minkin, who was a roommate of Goldman, and Berkman, I believe, too, at a moment. She was also an anarchist, but she and Most really became a couple. She was a common-law wife and becomes the mother of their two children. And unlike the previous anarchist who named a child Most and Minkin named their children John Jr. and Lucifer. So, John Jr. is I think he grows up, becomes a dentist. I think he's involved in NAACP. So I've been in touch with a grandchild of them, if I have that right, and he emailed me that he still has these little what is that called? These little pins, which is the photograph of Johann Most on it. He still has those. So I use the same. Oops, this is all a little washed out. I'm sorry. So this Kenyon has used. This is often used at the Harper's Weekly, I believe. So Yiddish anarchists didn't just attend lectures. They also organized their own groups in their own language. I think one of the impetuses is Haymarket. They learned from their German comrades about the International Working People's Association, the IWPA, which was this American anarchist federation set up in Pittsburgh in 1883. The Pittsburgh Manifesto, which was basically a distillation of Most's ideas, was by many groups adopted. Just a few quotes. Was translated into Yiddish in 1887. The present system was, quote, unjust, insane, and murderous, and must be destroyed through both, quote, peaceful education and revolutionary conspiracy. So a two-track strategy here. It was really the Haymarket trial and executions that really sort of made the Yiddish group sort of get organized. The Pioneers of Liberty were founded on Yom Kippur Day, which I'll have a little bit more on about that. Shortly after the death sentences were announced. In fact, I hope this map, so imagine sort of, again, the same kind of lower Manhattan there. So in fact, the first commemoration of the executions, so the year after 87, this was held on November 11, 1888, it seems to me one of the first joint public demonstrations by German and Yiddish anarchists. I have some really good descriptions of this, and so basically they start off at Felix Brecht's Singerhalle, which was a main German anarchist beer hall, really. And then so they march to Cooper Union, but they make a detour to pick up the Yiddish marchers right on Forsyth Street in Houston, and then they go to Cooper Union and have their big public commemoration. All right, the representatives of both groups were on the organizing committee for this. This was a big headline-grabbing sort of demonstration. And the Yiddish and German delegates were involved in this. Yiddish anarchist club life was always advertised in Freiheit. The Pioneers of Liberty financially contributed to Freiheit until they had their own newspaper, and then Most would raise money for that new Yiddish language newspaper. I think at the heart of the bond between Most and the Yiddish anarchist was militant atheism. I think it's a bit of an under-researched aspect of immigrant anarchism. It was really integral, I think. It's important to know that Most became an atheist before becoming a socialist. It's probably true with some other figures. In 1883, so here is, this is an announce, I don't know what's wrong with the slides, but so this is simply announcing in Freiheit, in German, the sort of the meeting times of the Yiddish anarchist groups. So here's another in Freiheit Most lecture. These were lecture series. He would talk about the French Revolution and all. He loved history. And so this is the Pioneers of Liberty. That's the German, of course, but this is the most important Yiddish anarchist group. So very symbiotic sort of relationship. Okay, back to militant atheism. So it's an important pamphlet that he writes, Most writes in 1883, Die Gottespest, or the God Pestilence. It's really it had a real sort of impact. It is translated in Yiddish by the London comrades in 1888. Chaim Weinberg remembered that this pamphlet is, that did it, that made me, not just an atheist, but made me adopt anarchism. So Most attacks basically the sort of man-made, as he sees it, monotheistic God as a brutal despot, holding humans, quote, under eternal divine police surveillance. He argued that religion has always served the powerful, and for these reasons, this is important, anti-religious militancy must be part of the anarchist movement. So, quote, every person released from deistic superstition, forbearing to oppose priesthood where and when and however an opportunity presents itself as a traitor to his cause. So it's not, this is, for immigrant anarchists, it's not just an intellectual debate, right? You have to be a militant about it and direct action against capitalist oppression. So, beginning in 1889, New York's Yiddish Anarchists organized a ball with food and drink on Yom Kippur Day, Day of Atonement, with the express purpose to mock and undermine orthodoxy. The London comrades had sort of initiated this. And this is in the press almost every year. There's a comment, and there's always a confrontation, but that's what they want. To my knowledge, the Jewish anarchists in New York keep this up. There's maybe some years where it's like prevented, but until 1909, and it spreads to other cities. Like I found an episode like that in Baltimore in 1890. So this is Freiheit. So most of my sources, of course, German sources, but this is Freiheit. Basically, I don't know if you could read this, but sort of announcing it, but also say, yes, good thing. Most always thought it was a great idea. He participated in almost every one of them. This is, I don't have time to go through it. If you know German, it basically is, here's how we fundraise off of that, and then divide the funds. So you see there, $10 for Freiheit, $10 for Freie Gesellschaft, which was another Yiddish publication, and then $5 we sent to London. So this is a thing. I could maybe quickly tell you about the 1890 Brooklyn Yom Kippur ball was prevented because the rabbis had complained to the police. And this became a huge story, not just in the anarchist press. And then there was a protest meeting, and I think Freiheit called the shutout. They were shut out. Freiheit called it Levite terrorism. And one other that sort of must have stung was Tsarism in America. So, okay, a few last remarks. This is about the passing of the torch that I think happens in the late 1890s, from the aging, splintered German movement to a youthful Yiddish movement. Little Germany had become the Jewish ghetto. Freie Arbeiterstimme was revived in 1899. I think there's a number of reasons for it. One has sort of been alluded to. The rank and file was really important for the Yiddish movement, was in the sort of garment workers, the exploited garment workers. The German movement was really rooted in the sort of narrow craft-based industries. The historian Paul Buell has argued that one of the strengths of Jewish radicalism is its peculiar cosmopolitanism. And the German one became sort of insularity, sitting in their beer halls. And there is, I want to quote this is 1895, this is a Staten Island mainstream newspaper. It used to be said a few years ago that the rallying point of the red flag socialist in New York was always a German lager beer saloon. But nowadays, one does not look in New York for anarchists among the Germans, but among the Russian Jews on the East Side. So, if I may wrap up here with how I started, I think anarchism endured in America largely because the Yiddish movement sort of carried it into the 20th century, the ideas and practices. Don't have to take my word for it. Chaim Weinberg, again, was 45 years old when Most died. He wrote, "The German anarchist workers, with Most as writer and speaker, not only created a powerful, influential German anarchist movement in America, but also helped create a Jewish as well as an American anarchist movement." That's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Ana Elena Torres will present on The Horizon Blossoms and The Borders Vanish, Anarchist Aesthetics in Yiddish Poetry. She is an assistant professor of comparative literature at the University of Chicago. Her forthcoming book is titled Any Minute Now, The World Streams Over Its Border, Anarchism and Yiddish Literature. This project examines the literary production, language politics, and religious thought of Jewish anarchist movements from 1870 to the present in Moscow, Tel Aviv, London, Buenos Aires, New York City, and elsewhere. Torres's work has appeared in Jewish Quarterly Review, in Geveb, Nashim, Makeshift, and the anthology Feminisms in Motion, a decade of intersectional feminist media. Please.
Hi everybody, how are you doing today? Yeah, it's really beautiful to see you all here, and it's also beautiful to come down from the microfilm machine upstairs and get to share downstairs some of all of the treasures that we have in the archive. So thank you, YIVO, and to the organizers, and to all the brilliant co-panelists. Hi Mom, hi Papi, thanks for coming. I'm really excited to be here today and to talk about the literature and the aesthetic influence of Yiddish anarchism. This was a movement that made the struggle for artistic expression and the struggle for free speech one of its central aims, and its press spanned the continents from Moscow and Tel Aviv to Buenos Aires and New York City. Today I want to give you just a taste of what's a very deep and very rich archive of Yiddish anarchist literature. So I'm going to start briefly with the earlier period of anarchist writing in the 1880s and 1890s, when the relationship between poetry and the movement was most explicit. Then I'm going to speak more about the experimental and modernist trends and talk about how anarchist thought and aesthetics persisted after World War I and World War II within Yiddish literature by focusing on the poet Peretz Markesh, who I argue was profoundly informed by anarchist aesthetics and whose later work indicts the Soviet state control of art. As has been outlined earlier, anarchism refers to a whole constellation of aspirations working towards bodily autonomy, towards ethical consensus, towards a world without borders and domination. Art and literature played a key role in developing the imagination of this kind of radical future. For the Yiddish anarchists, they were able to use poetic techniques, effects like bending time, unbordering nature, in order to prefigure a world after and beyond the state. Yes, so what do the Yiddish anarchists say about poetry? I would argue that we can't simply transfer models of Yiddish communism or socialist poetry onto the anarchists, because the anarchist ideal of art as liberation diverged from these communist models of art as duty, art as propaganda. For example, the poet Aaron Glantz Lealis maintains that, quote, poetry must be a helping tool, not to mention the maidservant of the labor movement, and all leaders must make it a part of socialist duty to compose poetry. In contrast to that communist model of what art or poetry has to be, The Yiddish poet and editor Yosef Ludin describes, quote, a deep bond between anarchism and literature. The difference is that Marxists mainly assail economic facts and concern themselves with the material side of the state regime, whereas anarchism is not content with that, but occupies itself passionately with intellectual production. Anarchism has never been an established policy, but a movement in process, according to Yosef Ludin. And as Kenyon said, Yiddish anarchists published more than 20 newspapers in the US, 12 of them founded between 1889 and World War I. During this period, a movement flourished that we call sweatshop, or proletarian poetry. Strident and yearning sweatshop poetry is epitomized by the work of Morris Rosenfeld, David Edelstadt, and Morris Winchevsky, whose Die Zukunft, the future, foretells a transformed world where the mourner will become a singer, all will become brothers, and truth will grow dearer, dearer like a friend. And in these verses, we can hear the echoes of Isaiah 61:2 about the restoration of ruined cities, when mourners will be comforted and captives will be freed. So thinking also about this as a kind of Jewish anarchist poetics. David Edelstadt's poem, Das ist Anarchie, This is Anarchy, idealizes a future where, quote, freedom will bring fortune for all, the weak and the strong, the he and the she. And in Yosef Bovshever's poem, Revolution, which is behind me, he writes, quote, I come like a comet newborn, like the sun that arises at morning. I come like the furious tempest that follows a thundercloud's warning. But I want to say that despite these very ecstatic visions of the future, theirs was not necessarily an absolute revolution. As the Yiddish anarchist editor Rudolf Rocker, who's been mentioned earlier, Rocker said, quote, I'm not an anarchist because I believe anarchism is the final goal. I'm an anarchist because there is no such thing as a final goal. The sweatshop poet's futurity echoes both what Rocker is saying and also contemporary theorists, such as Jose Esteban Munoz, who says, quote, the queer futurity that I'm describing is not an end, but an opening or horizon. It's a being in, a being towards, and a being for the future. So I want us to kind of think also about these kind of radical echoes between these movements. While the sweatshop poems are often anthologized as though they were only historical documents about labor rather than as themselves having integrity as literature, I want to emphasize that they were poetically innovative in their disruption of capitalist time. Rosenfeld's poem, The Sweatshop, for example, is structured as a schedule of the working day, where the clock becomes anthropomorphized as a boss, and the clock starts to scream, so, at the workers. When the lunch hour strikes in that hour of freedom, the dead come to life, and visions of the world to come appear. Time is liberated, flowing beyond the clock's regulation. The lunch hour becomes an island in time, hours a stream with no dam. And so just from that brief caption, right, you can hear that Rosenfeld is capturing the ebb and the flow of an alienated self over the course of the workday, not through repetitive slogans or flat language, but through inventive metaphor, right? And here are just a couple images from Arbeiterfreund, edited by Rudolf Rocker, who I quoted. You can see some of the aesthetics, right? This is a very kind of romantic aesthetic that they have. And here's a beautiful photo of the editors having a picnic in 1905 from the London paper. Yes, the style of the sweatshop poets spanned languages, and Emma Goldman's English language paper, Mother Earth, which is here, tended to print poetry in a very similar style of labor romanticism, which is to say that there was a kind of single style spreading across Yiddish language and English language anarchist poetry. And this affinity between the Yiddish and the Yiddish and English anarchist literature continued in the modernist period. Kenyon mentioned Freie Arbeiterstimme, which was as much a literary journal as it was a radical broadside. And while Soljanovsky, the editor, was launching the careers of Yiddish modernist writers, the most influential English language modernist journal in the US, which was Margaret Anderson's The Little Review, was largely an anarchist publication as well. So I want to emphasize thinking comparatively about what was happening in anarchist literature, both in English and in Yiddish at the same time. And here we have the two editors who are also partners, Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson. Anderson serialized publication of James Joyce's Ulysses until 1921, when copies of the magazine were confiscated by the post office for obscenity, and Anderson and Jane Heap were charged with indecency. From looking at the addresses on the correspondence of the Yiddish Anarchists, because this is what historians do, we're very nosy, we go through your mail 100 years later, but from looking at all of the addresses on the envelopes, I can see that some of the Yiddish Anarchists were actually working out of their offices. We have check stubs showing that they were materially supporting the editors here in their fight for free speech. And so there are very particular physical and material ways in which Yiddish anarchism was trying to make the world safe for literary modernism. In the same time, oh yes, and here's a passage from Margaret Anderson, which has this quotation, right? Most enlightened people know that anarchists are usually timid, thoughtful, unviolent people. Dynamite is not a part of their intellectual, but not their physical personality, right? All right, and so in the same period, we can look, and I don't have time, unfortunately, today, but this very striking illustration of kind of judge death is illustrating poetry and documents about the Sacco Vanzetti trial. There were something like 144 poems written about the Sacco Vanzetti trial. So again, literature was a form of poetic response to what was happening in the Yiddish anarchist movement. Yiddish modernism also blossomed in Europe and Russia, and one of the most significant journals was Chaliastra, the Gang, which appeared in Warsaw in 1922. One engraving depicts 3 boisterous figures in marching formation, arms aloft in the shape of the letter Aleph, and that's this one you can see. They're literally on the vanguard, right? The title of the journal, Chaliastra, proclaims their identity as a band roaming like medieval guilds of troubadours beyond the frontiers of accepted taste. One of its editors, Peretz Markesh, published a manifesto on the first page declaring, "Und so gehen wir zu werfen einzigweise und in einem in anarchistische Chaliastras, Bandes und Federatias." And so we go scattered one by one and all together in anarchist bands and federations. And so we here have a moment of an experimental manifesto, right, written in Warsaw that's explicitly identifying themselves as an anarchist group. Markish also came in contact with anarchism when he lived in the city of Ekaterinoslav, which was a key site for the Black Army, the Ukrainian anarchist army led by Nestor Makhno, the so-called Cossack of anarchy, who personally saved the life of Peretz Markish's father-in-law. So there are all of these historical echoes between Markish and the anarchist movement as well. Here he is in all of his glory. While primarily canonized as a communist poet, Markish's work is also deeply informed by anarchist aesthetics and ideals, especially his posthumous masterpieces. Hours before his arrest at Stalin's order in 1949, Markish gave his wife Esther several manuscripts. Among these was Der 40-jährige Mann, The Man of 40, a virtuosic and deeply enigmatic 80-page poem. The poem moves between expressionist scenes of war and revolution to visions of borderless space, radical temporality, and erotic liberation. As he handed her the manuscript, Markish told his wife, quote, "This is the best thing I've ever done, and I want you to take special care of it." His wife arranged for the manuscripts to be smuggled out of the country in a potato sack, saving work that Markish had begun in 1922 while editing Chaliastra, the journal, and continually rewrote over 27 years. The poem was finally published in 1978 in Tel Aviv. The Man of 40 pulses with the sounds and images of unfinished insurgency, often recalling the sweatshop poet's revolutionary temporality, as in these lines, quote, "Smashed are the clocks of capital and cities, smashed is the order of hours and days, overturned the calendar hangs on the other side, already withering, melting." And so here you can see some of the echoes, right, of the Rosenfeld poem that I read earlier, this idea of overturning time, overturning capitalist time and the structure of wage labor. For decades, Markish kept the poem hidden deep in his desk drawer, fearing the state's response to its subversive politics. The scholar Hannah Kronfeld writes, quote, "The Man of 40 is at once his most Jewish and his most anarchist book, and I believe it's the key to his life's work. Its anarchism, I argue, may be located in its poetic defiance of totalitarianism, its exuberant subversion of state communist iconography, and its central concern with the figure of the refugee. Against the USSR's policy of closed borders, the poem rhetorically abolishes all borders of time and territory, quote, "Zerbrochen der Stern, zerwolget sam, mir können schon gehen über Luft über Jam, neto is kein eigens, neto is kein fremd, will ich oisten dem treuer, wie ich to is a hemd." The obstacle is smashed and the borders demolished. We can pass now through air over sea. Property is no more, there's no ours, no theirs, and I take off my grief like I take off my shirt. In a recently declassified 1949 report written to Stalin, he urged the dismantlement of the Jewish writing associations in the Soviet Union and cited Markish specifically for, quote, expressing nationalist tendencies because of the Jewish content and some of the vocabulary of Markish's poetry. And if you look at the galley proofs of Markish's last book, you can see where the censor crossed out in red every time he uses the word Yid, Jew, and recommended that it be replaced with a universalist term like man or passerby. And we can also know, because of these galley proofs, as his wife recalled, quote, "The only thing we could count on was the abysmal ignorance and stupidity of the censors. They couldn't make head nor tail of difficult poetry, so they gave it's okay." Right? So they didn't understand the metaphor, but they saw the word Jew and they would take that out. Censors let slip by a section containing coded but furiously anti-communist passages in this poem. Markish depicts red monks, Monachen, as self-castrated bureaucrats. Quote, "Bei Nacht in der heilenden Heilmittellecht, sie schneiden vor Frumkeit sich aus durchs Geschlecht." Night in the caverns, in a cave with a piercer, piously they excise their sex. So this is his metaphor of censorship. And the pettiness of these red monks with stars on their sleeves he describes as very inhuman. But the poem ends, quote, "Nor jung is der Tag und frisch is der Tag, und so brot seid die Sonne als wie Flecken von Tol." But young is the day and fresh is the day, and the sun will scorch them to stains in the valley. But the bureaucratic censors couldn't recognize these trifling doomed monks as portraits of themselves, and so they let the poem be published because they didn't understand the metaphor. But also in this passage, Markish takes up the style of Bovshever and Edelstadt, taking up the proletarian style and deploying it against state censorship, adapting the original form of sweatshop poetry into a new and Baroque level of metaphor. In short, Markish's poetry was also formed as a response to the condition of censorship. In poem 40 of part 1, the poetic speaker encounters the body of a soldier left by the side of the road. The corpse's bones resemble schrift, or handwriting in a manuscript. The refrain of the Yom Kippur prayer, "Who by water and who by fire," is parodied by Markish as "Who by hammer and who by sickle." While the profound erasure of Jewish anarchist history has obscured these aspects of Markish's writing, in his own era, critics recognized the anarchist character of Markish's poetry. In 1923, the London newspaper Arbeiterfreund, I showed its beautiful banner before, reviewed Markish's poetry, claiming, quote, "Markish the Jew, the anarchist, walks with the heavy baggage of his people, a bleeding and wounded vagabond like Shimon among refugees and ruined ones. Markish's depth of being together with comrades is apparent. Here he is more comrade than poet. Here he is ours." From his very first published Russian poem as a teenager, which was titled Granitsa, or Border, to his last Yiddish work, the theme of the borderland remains central. This enthrallment is striking for a poet in a country with the world's longest border, where free movement was made illegal barely 2 months after the Russian Revolution, and Jews' freedom of movement had been restricted earlier as, quote, "an incitement to sedition." Against such realities, in 1935, Markish published a poem titled Moscow, imagining that city as the site from which redemption bursts into the world. Quote, "The horizon is putting on blossom, the realms are opening, and the borders are vanishing." The contemporary anarchist philosopher Thomas Nail writes, quote, "Borders are more like motors, the mobile cutting blades of society." And in Markish's poems, the border is often rendered as a space of violence, verwunden Randen, a wound on the edge of the earth. Yet that wound can be healed, as in poem 33, where he is describing dawn, And now I'm going to read you some poetry. Quote, "A waving, a winging, a twittering strikes. The forest is filled with joy, replenished by song. Any minute now the world will stream over its border, anointing with shine and golden drink. Just reach out your hand and tug at the mouth of the bare body, at the bare skin. And I'm here too, I'm fated to be upon earth at joy of daybreak." In another poem in the same book, Marcus hails human kinship with land beyond property and ownership. Quote, "Is this not spring heaped and multiplied upon spring? When children gather, they flock together. And what is a border and what is a limit when children are springing from land to land? And what could be forbidden to them after all when the earth rushes to meet them?" And in its final pages, the man of 40 returns to this radiant eroticism, foretelling an ecstatic future. Quote, "Multitudes upon multitudes arrive with joy. You hear no ripple of air, no flutter of flag. Faces bright as the flags of dawn. All is knowable and sunlit and clear. A day like a watermelon sliced open. Juice streams out, bright streams out. Sunsap pours forth, sunsap gushes. One wants to take the whole world in one's hands. Slowly take her together as one. Oh, there's still a wound. Here it still aches. Here it's unhealed. Aye, there's still a scar. And somewhere a flesh wound still oozing. She's barefoot. She steps on glass, stung by a wreath of thorny wire. And where it's neglected, where it's burnt up, still take her in your own hands." And so this is the final passage of this 80-page poem that he rewrote for 30 years and hid, and his wife had to smuggle out of the Soviet Union. And it ends on this kind of erotic utopian note, where masses assemble without energy, without ideology. You hear no ripple of air, no flutter of flag, faces bright as the flags of dawn. And in this moment of lucidity, banners and slogans are replaced only by the irreducible human face, in contrast to the image earlier in the poem where there's a flag shoved into the armpit of a soldier's corpse, reducing the fullness of life to a single symbol. Here at the end of the poem, the smuggled poem, the body of the earth remains libidinous and resilient, unbordered though wounded, undeterred by a land strewn with weapons. This female figure walks on into the future. And I want to end by saying that The Man of 40 was written by a deportee who is held behind the earth's longest border, yet he still prefigures a restless space with no flutter of flag, where the earth exceeds and overthrows its own borders, taking up in a modernist and experimental fashion the style and the form of earlier generations of anarchist poetry, especially the proletarians like Bovshever. As a reviewer at Arbiter Freins wrote in 1923, quote, "Marcus sings with wind and hurricanes, with the creative unrest of a furious world, carrying within himself the strength of Prometheus to hasten and scorch worlds and build other more beautiful worlds in their place." And so I would say that in spite of, or perhaps to spite, Soviet state ownership of time, of his time, Marcus's writing can still prefigure another temporality, neither the untroubled utopia deferred after the revolution, nor a kind of co-opted nationalist past, but rather a present that contains all possibility within itself, despite it all, a day like a watermelon sliced open. Juice streams out, bright streams out.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. We are ready to take your questions. I think we have, do we have two people who will run the microphones? And if you raise your hands so I can, oh, will you come down? Yeah. Please.
A question on the Yiddish as a defining characteristic. Did this generation aspire to sustain Yiddish and expand it to include non-Yiddish speakers in any way, or did they think that they were moving toward English, which would be more expansive and be able to cross language borders? How important was Yiddish to them?
Are you addressing your question to a particular speaker?
To the speaker who's nodding in recognition.
Oh, okay.
No, that's a fantastic question. So really, up until immigration restrictions are imposed in the 1920s, it seemed like a perfectly sustainable and reasonable strategy to invest in Yiddish culture, Yiddish language, and to sort of Yiddishize anarchism for Jewish immigrants because you had them streaming in. Now, of course, after World War I and immigration restrictions, that no longer becomes sustainable, and it creates sort of a long-term crisis for the Yiddish-speaking anarchist movement. But up until that point, right, the idea of fostering a specifically Yiddish anarchist movement, the idea wasn't that they were going to universalize Yiddish or that they were going to adopt a universalized English. It was really a vision of a cosmopolitan, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multiracial anarchist movement in the United States and the world, right? And so at the same time that these anarchists are investing in Yiddish and building Yiddish culture, they're also applauding other linguistic and cultural groups that are doing the same. They don't see these as contradictory or in competition, but rather, right, sort of each linguistic and cultural group should focus on fostering culture and radicalism in its own language. And of course, what we haven't really, Tom talked about this a little bit, multilingualism is sort of in the background here, because almost all of these people we're talking about are multilingual. They're just, so some speak Russian and Yiddish, some speak German and Yiddish, some speak English and Yiddish. So even as they're sort of, putting their eggs in the basket of Yiddish anarchism, many of these people also have one foot in Emma Goldman's circle around Mother Earth, or in Johann Most's circle around Freiheit. So in other words, you could be a Yiddish anarchist and an American or English-speaking anarchist. You could be a Yiddish anarchist and a Russian anarchist at the same time and sort of exist and move between those two spaces. But there is very much a focus, and it became more explicit over time, of fostering and keeping alive this sort of linguistic and cultural diversity as a positive good in and of itself.
I think if I can add to that, one of the interesting things about Yiddish anarchist language politics to me is that there was not a debate about what will be the Jewish language, right? The way that there was a Bundes debate about how Yiddish will become the international workers' language, or a Zionist debate about how there can only be a single language of the Jewish state. Instead, we had Harkavi, as Kenyon mentioned, writing a trilingual dictionary, right? Rudolf Rocker, who was a German speaker, but he also, in accounts of his son, Fermin Rocker, Fermin discusses how his father also spoke Spanish and would organize with comrades from Spain in London, although he's really remembered more for his Yiddish, but he also had these multilingual spheres. So it was not a debate about what will be the Jewish language, the way that we had in other Jewish political movements.
Well, I could maybe something I thought about with this question is what I remember. So the Yiddish anarchists organize an annual convention of all the Jewish groups in the U.S. really, and one issue that came up is like we need an English language speaker to come to the U.S. and there weren't that many in I guess in the U.S. And I think Charles Mowbray was one of the English who eventually come. But they're really discussing this not because Yiddish is sort of not a good language, but just for propaganda purposes in the U.S. Language, that's a big discussion among the Germans too. And by the way, Most never learned Yiddish, unlike Rocker, for example.
Another interesting thing is that there was some backlash against the Yiddish-speaking anarchists by Jewish English-speaking anarchists who saw the fact that they were using a minor language to evade censorship as a kind of sellout or something rather cowardly about the fact that they weren't writing in English when they could. Emma Goldman, for example, refused at a certain point to speak Yiddish in public because she said she wanted the FBI to know exactly what she was saying. But we can also look at some of the bilingual Yiddish and anarchist newspapers, for example, Freiheit from 1918, and see what was it that they could say in Yiddish that they couldn't say in English? What was it that they were saying in English that they were not saying in Yiddish? Yes.
Any other comments? Question?
What was their position on non-political economic radicalism like Henry George, linguistic radicalism like Esperanto? This seems to be a comfort zone that they might have been, friendly with.
Yeah, so Henry George is an interesting example because you do have examples of Jewish anarchists and other anarchists who largely subscribe to Henry George's sort of single tax movement as a sort of intermediary step, right, a short-term reform on the road to anarchism. You even had anarchists who were members of Georgist settlements and colonies in the United States. But that was definitely sort of a small stream within the larger movement. And Esperanto, yes, lots of anarchists were gaga for Esperanto. They held Esperanto classes. They published newspapers in Esperanto, although none published in the United States that I can think of. But for example, the first anarchist newspaper in China was published in Esperanto and corresponded with Emma Goldman's Mother Earth because they could, right, bridge that gap with Esperanto. But of course, Esperanto never really took root the way that they hoped.
I think that there was, just speaking to the language politics aspect of your question, there was some resistance towards having a politics of language in the same mode. For example, when I interviewed Audrey Goodfriend many years ago, and I said, Frau Arbeiterstimme continued to run from 1890 to 1977 and a half. Why is it that, why did you continue to write in Yiddish? Did you have a politics of Yiddish? Did you see Yiddish as a kind of holy language in a secular way? And Audrey said to me in her Bronx accent, I wrote in Yiddish because Yiddish is the language I spoke best. What are you, an academic? Fortunately, at that time, I was not. But there was also, I think we can't really import some of the language politics of the Bund to talk about the Yiddish anarchist context, but there were certainly utopian aspects. For example, Zev Gordon, the brother of Abba Gordon in Moscow in Anarchia, he had this idea to invent what he thought would be the most perfect language mathematically, and it would communicate with, this was kind of the beginning of the space race, and so the idea was that they would have a mathematical language that could, if we ever meet the extraterrestrials, communicate with them so perfectly. So this will be a new cosmic scientific language. He wrote a whole dictionary, and Yevgeny Fix, the artist who's here today, is also very interested in this and has been doing some beautiful artwork around Yiddish space utopian language. So check it out.
Comment from you?
I don't have, all I know, Moss, the only thing Moss did with George, I think, is just bash him. I remember Moss writing something about him because of his mayoral campaign in 1886, which went on, I believe, right when the Haymarket trial was. But because Moss was not for the 8-hour day necessarily in that period, and I think that was a big part of George's campaign.
Thanks. Question?
The messianic vision of Isaiah, which was mentioned in your lecture, it's also used extensively on a regular basis, both in Christianity and Judaism. But in a real world of where you have to deal with death and taxes, this is a great ideal which is very difficult to realize. So when we look at the practicality of the world, one has to wonder how the anarchist ideals, which are similar to Isaiah, can be realized in a practical way. So can you, I mean, there was not a system in the world, you know, we had communism, right? And which is failed. What would be the practical reason to put the anarchistic ideals into reality?
Who would like to answer that? I can say, I think, about the role of culture, right? If you are saying that anarchism is an anti-political movement, it's not about party politics, it's about the sphere of culture, and culture is going to be the realm of transformation of society. Then art and literature is extraordinarily important in developing a kind of everyday culture, and part of it is about the transformation of kinship and comradeship and a different mode of relating between individuals. And I think that's part of what they saw art doing, right? If you go on a steamship up the Hudson River with your Italian comrades and your Yiddish comrades and you sing together, this is trying to form a new everyday life, right? It's trying to form a kind of anarchist minhag, right? A kind of daily practice. And through that everydayness, through the kind of mundane details of life, there can be some form of transformation.
Yeah, so I don't have an answer to that, but I can tell you the answer that the Yiddish anarchists sort of eventually settled upon. Because in the early years when they were very close to Johann Most and the Germans and influenced by them, there was a lot, right, the conspiracy and sort of, right, dynamite. But that rather quickly faded, and the Yiddish-speaking anarchist movement and its organs like the Freie Arbeiter Stimme developed a sort of evolutionary rather than revolutionary approach to, right, social transformation. They began to realize, right, this transformation is a long way off still. It's not just around the corner like we initially thought. And they sort of developed you could say a four-pronged approach, which was one, right, being active in the union movement, the working class movement, and trying to radicalize it and right, infuse it with anarchist ideas. Second was the realm of culture, and very much, yes, right, changing how people thought about the world around them and interacted with it. Education, so this was both educating adults, but more importantly, educating children in a sort of libertarian manner, founding the Ferrer Modern School initially in Harlem, and then it moved to Stoughton, New Jersey, and really trying to, right, educate subsequent generations in a different way that would make these sorts of social relations possible. And then finally, trying to build alternatives outside of capitalism in the form of cooperatives, be they living cooperatives, productive cooperatives, or consumer cooperatives. And that was sort of what they saw as a long-term strategy to try to achieve that end.
Yeah, I second both of those answers. I mean, it's even, so yes, you're right, Johann Most was in the 80s especially sort of known for this insurrectionary talk and dynamite and condoning certain political violence and assassinations. But I think this is what I argued in my book, Beer and Revolution, which is available in, no, I'm just, but I argued that so there is that rhetoric, but then there is this other, I think in the 60s, they call it prefigurative politics. So they have these, you know, like the saloons and I think I argued those were little sort of mini anarchist worlds, if that makes sense, in the here and now. So we practice, and you know, theater groups and picnics, and so that I think it's important to get past some of the rhetoric sometimes that Most was really good at. Although, to my knowledge, he never really committed a violent crime. So.
Hi, this is mostly for Professor Torres, but I think in a lot of sort of leftist or radical Jewish spaces now, there's a sort of idea, maybe we'll hear more about this later, but that Yiddish is intrinsically or historically a political or subversive or anarchist language. And then I think also, at least in a large part of sort of Yiddish modernism, the Yiddish language was heavily theorized and thematized in various ways, and I wonder if we find that kind of work going on in the anarchist tradition of literature, or if there's a totally different approach to the language and these questions.
Same question. No, I'm just thinking. So the very long poem that I mentioned, the 80-page poema that was smuggled out, it was published in Tel Aviv in 1978, and it includes facsimile copies where you can see Markish's own handwriting, and then it's published in typeface. And this is very interesting too, because as some folks might know, Soviet Yiddish had its own orthography. Well, actually, there were 4 different kinds of Soviet orthography. One aspect of it was rewriting Loshen Kodesh words, so the Hebrew-Aramaic component of Yiddish, into a more phonetic way, as a way of kind of visually cutting the umbilical cord between a religious component of the language and the Soviet language of the day. And so the book becomes an interesting document of the peregrinations, the journeys of Yiddish, because you see that Markish is writing in Soviet phonetic type, and then it's being published in an Israeli book, respelled into standard Yiddish. So perhaps we could even think of that as a kind of multilingual text, you know, in that it preserves the accent or the dialect or the place in which it was written in that way.
Thank you very, oh, one more?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, well, this is for Elena Torres. Unless I'm mistaken, I read in Joshua Rubinstein's Stalin's Secret, what's that? Well, a book about Stalin killing the Yiddish poets, and also a biography of Paul Robeson that Peretz Markish was a functionary in the NKVD. If you could comment on that and what the relationship is between that and his anarchist and secret poetical work.
Sure. So I would not be so bold as to say that Peretz Markish was a straight-up anarchist who is a member of any anarchist federation, any more than I would say that Beyonce is a member of the Black Panthers because she wears a beret in her music videos, right? I think that there's a kind of aesthetic. This is operating on an aesthetic level. There's a kind of play with the movement and invocation of the anarchist ideals. He was an anti-fascist. He was a member of the Communist Party. However, what I do want to nuance is the fact that he received the Stalin Prize and the Lenin Prize, and this was sometimes seen as evidence of him as a state functionary. However, Avram Sutzkever recalls that the moment when he was informed that he was being given the Stalin Prize, he went completely gray and the blood drained out of his face, because this is actually a way of controlling him by giving him the award rather than lifting him up. This was a way of controlling his movement, of reminding him that the state's eyes were on him. So sometimes it's said, yes, he was only a communist poet. In fact, he was lauded by the state, and he was a state poet, right? He did write these odes, which I find less poetically interesting. But I also want to say that, you know, there are these accounts, for example, that he was the only person who would refuse to clap in events honoring state functionaries. So I'm not sure about that particular passage that you cited, but I do want to say that there's quite space. And similarly with Mayakovsky's early anarchism, and then Mayakovsky later becoming a state poet. I'm interested in that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming to the morning panel. This is your time for lunch. Thank you to all the speakers.